I'm able to do a sound check. I can hear me. I can see bars going up. Can you say a little something so I can?
Hello, how are you?
Beautiful.
Why won't you open?
Okay. So I hit record just to be able to do a good light check.
Okay.
And I'm not sure. Don't see any exposure bars. I think it's perfect, lighting-wise. I just would like to be able to kick it into something that's not perfect so that I can see that it's telling me whether or not you're
maybe if you open one of the shades.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm not much more beyond turn it on, point and shoot.
Yeah. I think that did it. I think that tells me that it would tell me if something was wrong. Except no. Well, this is good because if I have 1 minute of silence, then I can calibrate it if I need to transition later. So we're getting our 1 minute of silence.
There you go. Let's see what else can we turn it on.
What's that?
Try to think what else to manipulate the light.
No, I think it's perfect. I think the problem is that it's perfect, so it's not ticking off zebra bars to tell me part of it is overexposed. So there's nothing to fix, and that makes me nervous. But I think we're good to go on noise and on lighting, and we've got a great frame. I can actually zoom out a little bit and move this up so that wire doesn't bother you at any point.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Well, if at any point we need to readjust, you can just let me know. All right. Thank you for being so patient.
My pleasure.
Can you pull up a chair?
Yeah.
And grab my questions, and let's get started.
And here, you might want to grab one. Yeah, those are not the most stable. Those were my wife's grandmother's when she passed away, and they look much better than they are.
Oh, well, they're beautiful.
Yeah, they need to be something, whatever that is.
Reupholstered?
Yeah, and strengthened. They're all wobbly. This is a nice solid chair. These guys.
Awesome. Okay. Please tell me who you are.
Okay, my name is Mark. You want me to look at you or the camera?
I think that it works if you look at me.
Okay.
This is how I'm setting up the frame. So there's about this much negative space, and if you look off camera, it's just slight, and
Okay.
this is kind of what it looks like.
Sure. My name is Mark Zaid. I'm an attorney here in Washington, D.C., and I handle cases primarily involving what I would call government accountability, representation of federal employees, journalists, or others who have some sort of grievance against the U.S. government and other governments.
You testified about the dangers of the polygraph to the U.S. Senate in 2001. How did that statement come about?
Well, what had happened in the wake of Robert Hanssen, FBI special agent who had been discovered to have been a Soviet spy for upwards of almost 20 years, there was a big uproar about whether or not polygraphs would have made a difference. Hansen had not been polygraphed himself because he had entered the FBI prior to the polygraph program being instituted in the manner that it is now, which is anyone who joins the FBI has to pass a polygraph. And so this raging debate began, well, oh, if the diehards who were in support of polygraphs, if we had had them in place, we would have caught Hansen years earlier. And then there were those like myself who were attuned to the issue and the problems with it that were saying, well, oh, maybe, but more likely actually no, you wouldn't have caught him. He would have just passed it or talked his way through it like Aldrich Ames had done at the CIA. And what you really should have done is paid attention to your own special agents who had warned you, including his brother-in-law, that in fact he was seemingly making more money than a salary of an FBI agent, but they had ignored that too. So from what had happened, I'm trying to remember how that came about, let's see. So there had been an announcement. By this time I think I had already been engaged in litigation against the FBI and the Secret Service and the Drug Enforcement Administration over use of its pre-employment polygraphs. And there's a significant difference from a scientific standpoint between a pre-employment screening test, which actually there's very little to no science about, versus a specific use or specific incident exam. Is this the knife you used to murder your wife? Which would create different physiological responses than are you lying to, have you ever lied on your application or lied to someone you love? Some generic question where the examiner actually does not know the answer to. And when there was an announcement that there'd be a hearing, either I had been put in touch with or someone got in touch with me from Senate Judiciary Committee and was invited to testify as, I don't know, what do you want to call it, an expert or a viewpoint on one side. And there were, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us. There was someone representing the American Polygraph Association. There was someone representing, at the time, DODPI. It's been renamed Defense Department Polygraph Institute, which does all the training for the U.S. government. There was Jeff Smith, who was a former general counsel at the CIA. I know there was somebody else, and I don't remember who else it was.
In your testimony, you specify evidence exists that some agencies instruct their polygraphers to intentionally fail employees or generate false positive results. Can you say more about this?
Yeah, in the course of my representation, I've represented polygraphers who have worked at the CIA. I know a lot of polygraphers who have worked at multiple different agencies, and they have told us at times, and I think it's been documented in some books as well, that the polygraph was used as a device to target certain people. It is an interrogation tactic, and it does have a level of utility if the individual does not realize that the device itself, from a scientific standpoint, doesn't work. At least it doesn't work beyond registering accurately your physiological responses. So your heart rate, your respiration, your galvanic response, your sweat, your respiration. So that if you're asked a question and you lie and the device spikes, is that spike caused by the fact that you lied or because of the fact that your physiological responses registered something above a normal response? Your breathing increased, your pulse increased, you sweated more. Is that because you're lying, or is that because you're nervous about something? Now, if you can just grab it for me, so I can just shut it off. If there's nobody I need to talk to. Oh, he's not supposed to call yet. We are aware of people telling, and this is anecdotal, of course. There's no the biggest problem. There's no studies. There's no audits of government agencies about this. So you pick up pieces of information here and there, and you make the allegations that there seems to be some sort of systemic issue that exists throughout different agencies, and it will vary from agency to agency. You couldn't just say the U.S. government does this. You could say perhaps the CIA was engaged in this, or this group of polygraphers was engaged. And one of the tactics would be that, one, they would accuse you of lying or in saying the device was registering deception when it's not. That's fine. That's a valid technique. Or at times they would intentionally fail you or cause you to spike. Because it is a physiological response that is being measured, there are means by which examiners who are skillful can cause a reaction from you. And there was, in fact, a memo in one case at the CIA that I'm aware of where it was indicated that, you know, they're going to take care of this individual once they put him on the box, which is a name for the polygraph. This will take care of it because they could assure themselves to make it seem that he failed. And after that, they can take action. And that's been one of the biggest problems that I've had really with the device. It wasn't the use of it per se, although I have problems with that, but it was the use of it without any checks and balances. It was the misuse, really, and the abuse of the device. So that when you know, and all the studies that the government possesses show this, that you know the device doesn't work as a truth teller, especially in screening exams, that you then do not rely on it for that purpose. If you don't secure an admission from someone, and people make admissions, that's why the device has a utility, because people think so. They think it works, primarily because Hollywood and pop culture has created this impression that the device works. I mean, people don't go and read the Office of Technology Assessment study that shows there are more false negatives or false positives than accurate results. They know that Howard Stern puts Pamela Anderson on a polygraph and they ask, you know, whether do you like anal sex? And when she says no, the polygrapher says she's lying, and the audience loves that. That's what they like. That's what they want to see. They want to see Meet the Parents or whatever the movies were, where they're polygraphing the future son-in-law. So people think that it works. So when you go then to the agencies and you're polygraphed, and you are told that, well, there's a problem with one of your readings. I'm getting the sense you're not being entirely honest. So, I mean, have you used drugs more than what you're telling me? And then the person goes, oh, well, let me think. Well, I mean, it could have been more times than I did it in college. It is 20 years ago, but yeah, well, could it have been twice as much as you've said? Well, maybe, I don't really know, but I think so. And then, boom, you've got an admission, and that's the admission that's used against you. Now, whether or not that was a truthful way to elicit is besides the point. But the problem is, to some people, if they had maintained their composure and their consistency in their answer. No, in fact, I know I never used drugs. I've always wanted to be an FBI agent, and I never have used drugs in my life. I don't know why the device is registering that I possibly might have. But then that person loses out of the job because they did not pass the polygraph. That's what I have a problem with.
Can you tell me more about your experience with false positive victims as an attorney specializing in national security matters?
Well, a false positive is when someone who's telling the truth is registering as deception or inconclusive, but normally in a deceptive way. And it often comes up particularly in drug questions. I mean, that's the one question that really is the most problematic within the polygraph testing arena. Especially, these are questions that would come up more in the lifestyle exams rather than a counterintelligence exam. In fact, it wouldn't be on a counterintelligence exam. And the statistics range as to how high or how frequent false positives are. The biggest problem is that most of the studies, a vast majority, probably over 80%, maybe over 90% of the studies that the U.S. government and even I think private industry has conducted deals with specific incident polygraphs. What we would look at is more of what would occur in a criminal context. Again, you know, is this the knife you used to stab your neighbor? Versus a screening test where the answer is not known and the examiner really may in fact not know much, if anything, about your background. So, you know, have you ever used, how the question would be phrased, Have you ever lied to someone you loved? Have you ever betrayed the trust of someone you've loved? Are you telling the truth now as to what your drug usage is? And the questions may be worded different, but that's the gist of it. And the person would say, answer yes or no to a question that would be the opposite, and so they would register as a spike. And the statistics have been, at times, fairly high. I mean, better than chance that, in fact, you're being registered or shown to be a false positive when you're telling the truth, but the device is saying you've lied. And the problem with that is that if you continue still to maintain that, no, you're telling the truth, it's futile. The agencies will not conduct any additional investigations into whether you're telling the truth or not. They will just use the device as a weeding out device and just one facet of an application process. So it's the same as if you failed the 2-mile run. You had to do it in 14 minutes and it took you 14 minutes and 25 seconds, or you failed the urine test because you had too much protein in it or whatever might be the dividing line, and you're out. And the difference, though, is if you failed that 2-mile run, you can go and practice, and you can go and train, and the next time you may run that in 13 minutes and 10 seconds, and you'll be fine. Maybe you had a bad day that day, who knows. With the polygraph, though, there's still an aspect of the culture that looks at it that, well, one, okay, we know false positives exist, but we're not going to take that into consideration. And if you have registered deception, then that means you've lied. And that means it's going to be in your record that you lied. And it may come back to haunt you at a later stage in your career. So you fail an FBI polygraph, or as they say, fall outside of acceptable parameters, you are banned from employment by the FBI. Under the Privacy Act laws of the United States, other agencies can find out that you failed this polygraph. Now, that may impact you and it may not. That's part of the problem. They can get access to it. And some agencies will sometimes say, oh, you failed the FBI polygraph, we're not going to waste our time with you. Most agencies will say, our polygraphers are better than the FBI's, so as long as you pass ours, don't worry. But it also comes down to looking into one of these admissions and whether something has been made. So there's a lot of problems that are caused by false positives that can't be corrected by the individual and are not interpreted properly by the system. And it could have wide-ranging implications for someone over nothing more than your pulse rate sped up and we don't know why. And that's it. And that's where I see the inequities within the system and why false positives have caused a great deal of problems. I think even the FBI has admitted that at least 1/3 of its test results may be the result of a false positive. And false negatives, which is the opposite, someone who's lying but is registering as truthful, at times there have been some studies that have shown, I think, as upwards of 65% of those who are false negatives. And of course, if you're a psychopath, which many killers are, and you don't know the difference between right or wrong, then it's quite an easy time to lie, and yet the device would register you as telling the truth because physiologically, you're as cool as a cucumber. Yeah, I just killed all those 10 people, so what? No, I didn't do it. Look at me. I didn't do it. Do I look like I did it? No.
Can you speak to the effect of the polygraph on morale in governmental agencies and on the ability of counterterrorism and other security professionals to do their job?
Yeah, the polygraph has been an interesting device within the agencies. They've increased its use over the years. And you can start with a historical story. For decades, the polygraph was not used at the FBI because in or around, sometime in the 30s, there was a kidnapping case down in Florida The FBI had taken jurisdiction over kidnapping after the Lindbergh kidnapping and death of young Charles Jr., and they polygraphed a suspect in this kidnapping. And as a result of the polygraph, the suspect confessed. Well, it later turned out that the person was not the individual who perpetrated the kidnapping. He falsely confessed because of the browbeating and the polygrapher saying, you're lying, this device is telling me you're lying. So just to stop the process, he confessed. And so Hoover allegedly wrote, or somewhere there's a memo that says this, supposedly wrote on this memo, throw this thing in the Okefenokee swamp. I don't want to ever see it again, because he realized how unreliable it was. And I mean, and it's not the device itself, it's the examiners. I've had clients who have hooked people up to photocopy machines and said it's a truth-telling device. And these are criminals, and they're stupid most of the time. So, hey, did you rob that convenience store? No. Push the button, out comes, you're lying. It says you're lying. Well, I was there, but I was driving the getaway car. Or drunk drivers who are pulled over, and most of my clients are oftentimes at least, they are law enforcement. So, pull over a drunk driver. Okay, come here. Hold on to the car antenna. Have you been drinking tonight? No. And somebody will honk the horn. I have this car hooked up to a truth-telling device, and you were lying to me. Well, I had a couple of beers, but I had it with dinner. All right, is that all you've had? Yes. All right, you're lying. Well, all right, I had a couple of scotches too, and so on. And yet the agencies have increased their use. So the Bureau went to mandatory polygraphs in 1994 for everyone. DIA in 2008 expanded its use. One, because it's a weeding out device that is more economical than doing a background investigation. They have so many applicants to choose from that, quite frankly, they're willing to just allow good applicants, good individuals to be denigrated in many ways and lose them in the hope that they are betting that if you can pass the exam, the likelihood that you're going to do something wrong in the future will hopefully be less. Of course, I don't think there's any studies for that. But what the heck was the underlying question on that one, too? Because I know I kind of went off on a tangent.
Oh, let's see. It was about the effective polygraph.
Oh, and the morale. Okay, so I think it would be accurate to say that there are very few people inside the government who enjoy being polygraphed. It can be a very harrowing experience. It can last several hours, and depending on the polygrapher, can be a very nasty time. There are agencies have or handle polygraphs very differently. I can tell you as a general rule that Secret Service polygraphers would often be a little bit more aggressive than FBI polygraphers. Now, these are general rules. Sometimes you have an FBI polygrapher who's very aggressive, and you have a Secret Service polygrapher who's very polite. Inside the intel agencies, it can hit or miss. It will depend on, are you an applicant? Are you already an employee, and this is your periodic reinvestigation? Are you under investigation for something? And styles will differ, and they'll will be different. Styles will differ depending on that type of investigation, depending on the polygrapher, depending on the agency. So morale-wise, they don't like it, but they recognize it as, this is what I signed up for. I knew I was going to come into the agency, whatever agency, and I'm going to have to take it. So I'm going to have to literally suck it up and just deal with it. But they learn how to deal with it. That's why, and there can be debate about this, but you could argue that a polygraph has never caught a spy. Never caught a spy. The agencies or the government will say, well, no, that's not true. You know, there were a number of cases where, say, Harold Nicholson, and he was put on a polygraph, and it was only because, the polygrapher extracted this information from him that showed that he was undertaking this type of espionage activities. Well, not entirely true. Yeah, the information developed as part of the polygraph, but it developed because of the polygraph interrogation tactic, not the device itself. It could have easily have come up during a regular background investigation type examination or a more focused criminal investigation. There are any number of cases where those who were proven to be committing espionage did in fact pass the polygraph. Countless times, quite frankly. Now, Aldrich James didn't necessarily pass per se. He apparently registered as showing deception, but he talked his way through because, after all, if you're inside the CIA, you can't be committing espionage against the CIA. That would be unheard of. Anna Montez at the DIA, same thing. There were a slew of Cubans who defected to the United States in the 1980s, apparently all of whom passed polygraphs. There's also the problems, and I'm not aware of any publicly available studies, but I can't imagine there does not exist studies on this now. But a polygraph exam is very much a Western culture, and it's not going to work on some other cultures that have or view truth differently. After all, it's all about what the individual is perceiving them to feel. And there are cultures, and I'm not going to name any of them, but there are cultures that historically or generally are perceived as to view an ability to be truthful in a different manner, or has a different interpretation of what truth is, or has actually no penchant whatsoever for lying. They grow up differently. And I'm not saying there's bad culture, different. It's a different culture. And the polygraph is very much a Western device based on Western values, which is why if you apply it outside of that, it doesn't necessarily work. Which is also why it doesn't work if you have some guilt complexes. If you're very religious, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, doesn't really matter. If you're very religious, you're probably going to have problems on the polygraph. If you're very nervous, probably going to have problems on the polygraph. There's a reason why there are an extraordinary number by way of percentage of Mormons within the CIA. They pass polygraphs very easily because of the background that the Mormon religion instills in their followers. It's very conducive for polygraph testing.
Okay, briefly on history, and then we can move on to devil's advocate arguments. You're the best person to briefly tell the story of the magic lasso and how it relates to the polygraph. Would you like to do that?
Sure. One of the things that's great about the polygraph, it's been around for a while and it's gone through different machinations and it's had different parents, so to speak. But one person who is responsible very much so for bringing it into the pop culture market is a man named William Marston. And he lived in the 20th century. I think he died in 1948 or so. He was probably born in the late 1800s. And he brought the polygraph into sort of its current form primarily in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And he used to participate with ad campaigns for shaving. Is this razor the best razor? The polygraph says, people say that this is the best razor ever. Or he would run ads for wives, do you want to find out if your spouse or your husbands are cheating on you? We'll put them on a polygraph. Well, what he's also now well known for is that under the pseudonym of Charles Moulton, he created the comic book character for DC Comics of Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman has her magic lasso that requires those who are caught within its grasp to tell the truth. And that's not a coincidence. This was because that Marston, the grandfather or father, as you want to call it, of polygraph, created this truth-telling lasso. And it's very apropos because it shows that the polygraph and the magic lasso, they're both based on the same thing, which is really just science fiction. It's this perception of whether or not that it works. So this is this lesser known story because most people don't know, but it's a known story now if anyone wants to look at it. I always get a real kick out of it, the relationship that really shows you that the U.S. government is basing these fundamental questions on people's integrity based on a science fiction character's prowess, is really what it comes down to.
One of the primary polygraph proponent arguments for continued use and even escalated use of polygraphs in pre-employment and employment screenings for the U.S. government has been the argument that we're prioritizing national security over individual liberty or comfort even. Do you have a response to this argument?
The argument that the government's prioritizing national security by increasing use in the polygraph is a misnomer. What they're prioritizing is allocation of resources. It's a lot cheaper for an agency to have a GS-13, which is probably making $65,000 a year if they're lucky, to undergo 14, 15 weeks of polygraph training and then come back and stick them on applicant background tests to try and remove the need to do a background investigation, which can cost thousands and thousands of dollars, by just putting someone on the box for 3 to 4 hours. Now, again, there can be an argument that there's a utility to the device. I mean, one can't argue that there is a utility to the device because people have made admissions that they otherwise would not have made and would not have otherwise been caught by any type of investigation. But those are fewer and far in between the vast numbers of people that are falling victim to false polygraphs and are having their careers derailed, if not, in fact, permanently damaged. And I would at least argue that the balance for that is skewed the wrong way. And there's no taking into account, there's no accountability for the problems, recognition of the problems of the polygraph, which in fact the U.S. government knows exists.
And so you've touched briefly on the other main polygraph proponent argument, which is that you can't take away this tool. As imperfect as it is the best independent credibility assessment tool, or it's the best approximation to a lie detector that we have, or it's the best interrogation prop.
Yeah, the polygraph, I mean, this is what it's historically always been, has been an interrogation tool. And that's a key word right there. It's a tool. It is not the end-all to end-all. If the polygraph worked the way it's perceived to work, you would not have a pre-test, test, post-test type situation. In fact, you wouldn't even have an examiner, a human examiner. You wouldn't need it. You would have the individual who's being tested either sit there and read the questions to themselves out loud and then answer while hooked up to the machine, or you'd have a computer now verbalize the question and you'd answer. You wouldn't have to go through the rigmarole that they do now to figure out. I mean, in the admissions, of course, that people make that demonstrate the utility to the device, it's not during the test itself. It's during the pre-test. It's during the post-test. I mean, oftentimes, it's before the person is ever hooked up to the machine. The machine hasn't even been used yet. It's the polygraph examiner going over the questions that they're going to ask. Have you ever exceeded the drug usage that the FBI says? And that's not the way the question would be worded. But when the drug usage policy of the FBI was you could not use, it's been changed. 15 instances of marijuana, whether that's sniffs or puffs or joints or instances, nobody ever knew. That was one of the problems. But You could not have used marijuana more than 15 times within 3 years. 15 times overall, and you couldn't have used it within 3 years. So the polygrapher will go, I'm going to ask you a question about this policy. You say on your SF-86 that you smoked marijuana 6 to 7 times. When did you do that? Oh, I did that when I was in college. When was that? Oh, that was 7 years ago. Okay. 6 or 7 times. Now, do you remember all the times you did it? No. Okay. When did you start? I remember I started here and I finished here. So you're estimating. Yes. Could you have done it more? Well, yes, I could have done it more. If I go talk, and the so on and so on, and by that time, then they'll get up to, oh, well, okay, I did it 12 to 15 times. Which now because you've changed your response, you're accused of lying on the SF-86. Or you've hit 15, so now you're outside the parameters, and you are now dismissed from the applicant pool. And they won't tell you that you're not being dismissed because you failed the poly necessarily. You've been dismissed because you made an admission that is contrary to a policy that exists within the Bureau, all without having been hooked up to the device. And oftentimes that's what happens. Or the contrary one would be, the examiner says you've registered deception. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. And they have a post-test. Now, you're hooked up to the machine, but the machine's not registering what you're saying during the post-test. You're engaged again in this back and forth with the examiner as to why possibly could you have registered this. Oh, well, I didn't use drugs, but my roommate in college did all the time. And they sold drugs and they had drugs in the room. And, when they got high, I used to breathe in the smoke, and I think I got high too, but I never smoked. All right, so you knew there was criminal activity in your room, and you did you say anything? No, I never said anything. Did anybody ever come to the room and your roommate wasn't there and they were going to pick up the drugs? Yeah. Did you ever give it to him? Well, yeah, I just gave it to him off the desk. Yeah. Oh, okay, so now you facilitated the sale of drugs. I mean, it would be things like that would happen. And it's not the examination that ever came up with it. It was the interrogation. It was the discussion. I mean, that's why polygraphs are not allowed in criminal cases unless both sides agree, which is rare. Why is it that is the policy? Why is it that polygraphs are not allowed? Because it is viewed that if it's accepted in the way it's manipulated or held out to be as a truth tester, meaning it's right or it's wrong, then it's replaced the need for the jury, because the jury is trying to determine credibility. And if you introduce this polygraph evidence that says the person registered deception to whether or not this knife was the one used in the crime, you've removed the need for the jury to determine guilt or innocence, because the polygraph has. Now again, if it worked in a perfect world, okay, well then now we don't need a jury system, because we just polygraph people. But we know that's not the case. So why is it then we apply it to screening tests? Is beyond me, beyond just using it for trying to bring out certain information. But if you're unsuccessful in doing so, the results should not be used against the person. Certainly should not haunt the person going forward to other federal jobs or local law enforcement. And that's the problem, because it is now.
So what are the incentives of polygraphers to generate false positives, false confessions, or even to falsify records? And this gets into the possibility of meaningful checks and balances that you were talking about.
I probably would say from the outset that the vast majority of polygraphers are honest individuals who are just trying to do their job and believe in the system. there are, as in any field or industry, there's going to be polygraphers who abuse the system, who are intentionally lying to people, who are failing people. And that's been recounted in books. One of my clients, John Sullivan, who was a CIA polygrapher, has written about the fact that there were bad apples, a minority of bad apples within the CIA's polygraph division at different times over a period of 30 years. Now, oh God, what was the question? Tell me the question again. I'm getting old.
Incentives to generate false
Oh yeah, okay.
positives and checks and balances. It was so broad.
So, that's all right. From my perspective, having deposed a whole number of polygraphers and met a number of polygraphers over the years, some of whom I count as my friends, they're my clients at times, I view it, it's a game. I mean, it really is a game. How does one demonstrate skill as a polygrapher? Again, it's not, well, they're the best ones of hooking up the respiratory device, or they put that finger galvanic response tool on a person's finger better than I've ever seen, or they can type on the computer, because all these polygraphs are now computerized for the most part, hooked up to the laptop, and they just type fast. You know, that's not what it is. It's the skill that the examiner demonstrates as an interrogator, as a questioner. And how does one measure how skillful that examiner is? Well, who has elicited the greatest number of confessions, or the most egregious confession? The FBI will tout, well, we got this applicant to admit that he embezzled from his employer. The employer didn't even know that he had been the victim of a crime. And if it hadn't been, it never would have shown up then on a background investigation. So if it weren't for the polygraph, then we never would have known about this crime. Well, no, it wasn't the polygraph. If it weren't for the skill of this polygraph examiner to have elicited from this idiot who was an applicant for the FBI and had gotten that far into the process as a crook, which says something else, then you know, you never would have known about this otherwise. So it's the skill of this individual in learning how to use the polygraph as a tool rather than the device itself. And that's where the problems come up. When the device gets escalated or put on a higher pedestal than really the accuracy of it, and it's not the skill of the examiners that come into play. And again, you know, they could just be a skillful examiner as part of a background investigation. Or, as I had indicated before, it could be their use of a photocopy device. Now, the Army's been using these handheld devices in the field in Afghanistan and giving them to 20-year-old sergeants to just put on the fingers of Afghanis and say, okay, this is a polygraph device. You know, do you know where the insurgents are? No. You're lying. The device says you're lying. And then using that as a means by which to determine if their informants are valid. So, I mean, now you've got people who aren't even trained with any type of skill, and you're just relying on the device. Now, technology at some point in time may allow for this. Maybe we will have a polygraph device that actually registers truth. Right now they're working on brain synapses and determining, well, apparently if you lie, there's areas in your brain that will light up as red, and the science, there's promise, I guess it would be the way to say it. There's at least evidence there could be something to that. They're not there yet. They was at one point in the 70s, voice stress analysis that was used. That supposedly, you know, if I say, oh, I've never done drugs, and I know I have when I was in high school and college, that my voice, if it was placed into the machine that knows how to register or analyze it, I don't think I sounded any different. I've never used drugs. I don't think I've sounded any different. But apparently, I was lying because the voice stress analyzer would register and indicate that I was. And the danger or the beauty, depending on where you were coming from with that type of device, was you don't have to be there. They just have to take your audio recording. And you yelled at a news conference, I'm just a patsy, I didn't kill President Kennedy. And they put that into the machine, and yeah, he's lying, or he's telling the truth. So you don't even have to be there. And again, there's reasons why that hasn't reached the level of prominence in use since it came to be focused on 30, 40 years ago, because obviously it doesn't work.
So who's profiting from the current use and abuse of polygraphs?
That's a good question. Who's profiting? Well, I guess there's always somebody who's profiting. Who's profiting? I mean, there are manufacturers of polygraphers, and there are people who do instructions, and I don't think one can easily say it's as if, well, the manufacturers of the polygraph technology are holding it out to be at a certain level, and they're misleading people. I don't think you could say that. In fact, most of the research is really done by the U.S. government. The polygraphers they have a technology, and I have a feeling the manufacturers, they know what the technology can or cannot do, and they sell that to the United States government. I mean, or not just the U.S. government, it's local law enforcement, state law enforcement that use. It used to be department stores. I mean, until the Employee Polygraph Protection Act in 1988, it was anybody and everybody who was using the polygraph, and that was the problem. In fact, the congressional testimony from 1988 is just eye-opening as to the abuses that existed with respect to the use of polygraphs in the private fields of people that were really having their lives ruined because they were being accused of all sorts of crimes that they never did because some examiner was using it. And again, it was the examiner that was the problem, not necessarily the device. Because again, what's the device doing? The device is registering your pulse rate, it's registering your blood pressure, it's registering your respirations. It's registering them accurately. It's the interpretation of that that's coming into play. So if my blood pressure is 118 over 75, what does that mean? If I go to one doctor and the doctor says, that means you're really healthy. Great, thanks. Or if I go to another doctor and says, well, as far as I'm concerned, anything over 110, you're susceptible to a heart attack, and we better get that down. It's all the interpretation of what the results are. So, if you had to look at it from a profiteering standpoint, it's not in the way of profiting. It's a way of conserving resources. Because again, agencies will use it as a weeding out device to try and minimize their need to expend a significant amount of money on background investigations, on gumshoe work, on putting feet to the pavement. And also, it is certainly obviously used as this kind of feel-good device. I can tell you, I've seen it used increasingly now in the State Department, the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department historically was very much against polygraph use. And it often stemmed, just like it did with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, because someone important or powerful had a negative reaction. And the story was, I think it was Secretary of State Baker in the early 80s. I think his secretary failed the device, and he was very upset, and so polygraphs are banned. I think that's at least the pop culture story. Now, what I've seen in the last few years is the State Department has increased its use of the polygraph, typically in counterintelligence cases where a Foreign Service officer is recalled back from a post because of concerns that they may be socializing with a foreign national who perhaps is seeking to commit espionage against the United States. And they're voluntary exams, which most typically are, but they're voluntary, much more voluntary. When I say voluntary, they are actually voluntary. There's not going to really be a negative repercussion if you decline, at least not yet in the State Department. They're not allowed to look at it that way. But there is a very much a carrot to the stick with respect to the polygraph, because the State Department will use it as an exculpatory tool. Oftentimes in instances where they have no proof one way or the other that the person did anything wrong. Now, which maybe they were socializing with somebody who was conducting espionage, but they were involved with a romantic relationship and they didn't know anything about it. It never manifested itself to a level that they realized there's something going on, or something much more innocuous than that. But so there's no proof one way or the other. So they'll offer the polygraph as a means by which to exculpate yourself from the allegation or concern that maybe you did something wrong. So the device is administered, the test is administered, and you pass. If you pass, more often than not, and I could probably say statistically higher than that, everything's fine. Okay, you're back to work. We couldn't find any proof of anything. You passed the polygraph. We feel good. We could say the device registered truthfulness. So we're not the ones who have to make the human judgment as to whether this person's lying or not. And if the person fails, it's not as clean cut that that's the end, the person's fired or anything. The person often would be placed into some sort of limbo, or eventually someone human is going to have to make a judgment. Well, what does that mean? We know it doesn't necessarily mean what it says, so what do we want to do? Maybe we want to assign them somewhere else outside of that country so that they're never back there. That's the precaution we're going to take. We're going to watch them more carefully, etc. But it has become much more of not a device of profit, but a device of convenience.
So what needs to change?
It's not the use of the polygraph per se that's the problem. It's how the results are used and the ramifications from it, the scope of it. If I was able to change things, I mean, ideally it would be great if one didn't have to use it. But I really don't have a problem with its use per se as a tool. And as with any tool, the question is, are you using the tool properly or are you abusing the tool? Now, I could take a hammer, and a hammer is an incredibly useful tool to civilization. We couldn't have gotten where we are today if it weren't for a hammer. But if I take a hammer and I smash it on someone's head, that's an abuse of the tool. So the question then is, how is the polygraph being used and what are the results of its use? So if you have someone who undertakes a screening exam and registers deception as to drug use, counterintelligence, whatever it might be, but makes no admission whatsoever, what do you do with that? So the current process would be you lose the conditional offer of acceptance that you were given for the job. So there's a short-term immediate loss right there. You may be permanently banned from employment within that agency, and you may be 29 years old, up for a job, Harvard grad, Rhodes Scholar, volunteer in your religious institution to feed the homeless, and now all of a sudden you've been permanently banned from being an FBI special agent or counterintelligence analyst because of this device. That's it. It may impact you across the board at other agencies because it's in your file, in a file that is legally accessible to other agencies. And while it's not the norm or the rule, it has happened, and I've seen it happen, where you failed a polygraph at this agency and it adversely impacts you at this agency or that agency. So at least in looking at how the current framework and trying to be realistic, because we're never going to get rid of the polygraph altogether because it's just gone too far. The disease has spread too much. So now the issue is, what can we do to stem the tide or to be able to live with the disease? I don't know if I want to compare polygraphs to AIDS, but if you looked at it, you know, when AIDS was first discovered in the 80s, if you got AIDS, you died. Now if you get AIDS, you know, with proper drugs, you live, and you can live a nice, normal, healthy, to some extent, healthy life. Well, polygraphs in some ways, sort of, they exist, what can you do? Okay, so you cannot use a polygraph result for the basis of any employment decision, plain and simple. If that's all you've got, that's insufficient and irrelevant. If you can get somebody to make a confession, so be it. And believe me, I've had any number of people come to me afterwards and say that they falsely confessed because the polygrapher said, look, if you just come clean and we can just get you beyond the polygraph, everything will be fine. So they'll come to me after and say, yes, I admitted to using drugs and I never did. And I shake my head and go, oh, okay, great. So you just committed a felony by lying to a federal agent. Good job. I can't help you. No, I'm sorry. And I'm not going to argue that, no, you really didn't register deception on the polygraph because you were lying when you said you used the drugs. But then again, you did register deception because you were lying when you... Okay, no, forget it. You know what? Go find another career. This one's not for you in law enforcement. But the key would be, you know, no reliance whatsoever. That I would say it can't be used beyond what that current use is. It shouldn't be able to be disseminated to other agencies. It should be destroyed. If you're going to, whatever you're going to use it, I think the record should then be destroyed. Again, we're talking no admissions. And that's the problem that the agencies want to avoid, because they don't want people to know that if you don't make it, if you know the device doesn't work and you don't make any admissions, you may be okay. That's not what they want, because that would be counterproductive to what they're trying to use it for. So no use for adverse employment decisions, no dissemination. I mean, that in many ways, I know there was something else that I'm blanking on, maybe will come to me, but I mean, those two things, no adverse employment decision and no dissemination, would solve many of the problems that exist. It would install a series of checks and balances that doesn't exist currently. Now, it does in some agencies. Defense Department has a regulation that says they can't use an adverse polygraph determination for employment decisions. I don't know if all the Defense Department agencies know about that, but it does exist. And I find that fascinating, because why is it that the Defense Department has come to that realization, but the CIA has not? Doesn't make sense to me. I think polygraph results should be available. Many times the agencies will classify the polygraph, not just the results, but the polygraph report. I think that polygraph examinations need to be recorded. Audio at a minimum. Video if possible. Some of the agencies do this. And again, I think it calls into question the reasons or why don't others when some do. The Secret Service audio tapes, it's polygraph examinations. The FBI does nothing. Why is that? Well, I think you're going to run out of film. We got a couple minutes to finish this one?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I look at it as audio or videotaping the examinations protects everyone. And I could say that as an absolute fact, because I've heard polygraph audio tapes. And I would have clients come to me and say, this was the worst experience I've ever had. I was there for 5 hours, the examiner cursed at me, the examiner yelled at me. It was a very hostile exam. And I would listen to the tapes. There were some curse words used, but it was in the context of the conversation. All right, I could see maybe some of it got a little tense in the questions, but hostile? I wouldn't say hostile in what I would perceive to be hostile. It was more of the person is in a frame of mind as the one being polygraphed, and they weren't expected to be confronted. They were a detective in a state law enforcement agency being accused of drugs. I'm being filmed. In fact, you're on film that I'm talking to you right now. I'm being filmed right now. I'm doing an interview. Okay, so let me call you back. I don't know, they were at T-ball. I don't know. Why, is she sick? Oh, I mean, I don't think they were hugging or anything, so just check her. Well, we'll have to check them. We'll have to check us all. Okay. Bye. One of the little friends has lice. So.
That's going to be the trailer.
Yes. All right. So the audit. So it is perception, and people perceive things. It doesn't have to be polygraphs. Any human can just recall certain situations where of what perception and how you perceive the conversation, how you perceive tone. You read an email, you interpret it differently with the tone. It was the same thing when you're in a heightened emotional state for polygraphing, and I had to objectively state, look, I heard your test, and I have to tell you, it wasn't as bad. So objectively, it's not as bad as you made it out to be. Well, that protected the agency involved, and their examiner, and it also protected the individual because sometimes there is some sort of abuse. And now I don't know if the agencies are saying, oh, it's a cost factor. We got the audio tapes, and how much an audio tape costs, or the film. Well, hey, I mean, you could tape over them. You keep them for, say, a 6-month period of time or a year, whatever it might be. It's not that expensive. But I can only think it's not being done because they want to have the ability to, frankly, be abusive. And they are. And I can also tell you, having observed polygraphs with clients, that I have never sat in on an exam where I thought the polygrapher was out of line. Did I think they asked a couple of hard questions during the pre-test or post-test? Yeah. Did I think the person crossed the line? No. I thought it was an interrogation tactic. It was fine. I prepped my client for it. Hopefully the client performed the way that they should have. And there's a difference. That too tells me there's a difference between the horror stories where there's no lawyer and the proper, balanced implementation of an exam when there's a lawyer. And there really shouldn't be any difference. So there are a lot of different steps that not even in the ideal world, in the realistic world, in the practical world or environment, that I would implement that I think would still allow for the use of the polygraph, but also protect those who are being polygraphed. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about accountability. We want to make sure that the polygraphers aren't being abusive and inappropriate, and we want to make sure that those who are being truthful are not being unfairly punished. And I can give you another anecdote, but I don't know if you want to switch that before we get started. This thing keeps popping into my head. What's my anecdote? Oh yeah, remind me. Drug accusations of law enforcement personnel.
Okay.
So that we can do it. I've got maybe like 30, 45 more minutes or
Oh,
so.
it was supposed to beep when it ran out and it didn't beep.